when I was looking for my next role. Nothing excited me as much as working for a company based in Portugal and learning a whole set of just cultural practices. I was at a point in my career, it was a good way to re-stimulate my brain.
Hello, and welcome to Global Professionals in Portugal. My name is Cordelia with High Score Strategies, and I'm here today with Greg Sherwin. He has authored a book called Connecting Online, Creating a Successful Image on the Internet. And he's also been a successful business person. He's been living in Portugal for over 6 years, and he is going to share some of his lessons learned with us and his journey. Greg, thank you so much for being here. Your stories, like many of our stories,
Uh,
is a little bit complicated. Can you just share us a little bit about your journey and how you came to be here today?
yeah, I'll give you the short version of my career arc. And I started out more of a technologist, really looking at math and science and technology, and eventually everything I was doing ended up getting involved in coding. And despite the fact that I worked in areas like satellite communications and bioengineering, and then ended up working in the web and became a manager and leader. There was about almost 30 years in Silicon Valley where I worked in a various startups that blew up, some that really blew up. I was always more interested in how do things connect. My last role in the US was I was head of engineering for an organization called Singularity University. And it just gave me a much more global view. And I realized this was around 2016 or so.
Okay.
I just realized that I was interested in seeing some technical and innovation from a different cultural lens, because I was feeling like in Silicon Valley, you can feel like you're too close to the sun, you can't see stars. And when I actually was on travel, because my wife has Portuguese heritage and we've often gone through here, and it just they had gone through a major bond crisis, and so they decided, instead of what Greece did, to go into austerity measures to deal with it. Portugal created a lot more incentives for the government to help sponsor entrepreneurs and entrepreneurship and invest in sort of technology startups and trying to modernize its economy. And suddenly it struck me, hey, wow, I could do something productive here in a totally different cultural context that would be regenerative for me. When I was looking for my next role, nothing excited me as much as taking a major pay cut, working for a company based in Portugal, and learning a whole set of just cultural practices. I was at a point in my career, it was a good way to re-stimulate my brain, just because of getting a little comfortable with a lot of the same things.
So now your wife is Portuguese, right?
Yes.
Okay.
She's
So
born in California, but both her parents immigrated from the Azores. She
okay.
spoke Portuguese around the home as her first language, etc. So she identifies 100% American and 100% Portuguese at the same time, which
Right.
I think is a lucky coincidence.
It seems like there's a number of people who don't feel at home in any country. Like
Exactly.
they're not 100% anything.
I've heard that too, where it's like the first time you move somewhere else, you never really can be home again in a way. It
Right.
sounds dystopian, but I can understand where that comes from, because going back to where you came from, all of a sudden you realize it's changed and you're not the same person either.
Yeah. It's interesting. I think a lot of the Portuguese diaspora is coming back. You had a lack of economic opportunity. And like many countries, people leave one country to another where there's better opportunity. And then now you have better opportunity here.
Yeah, this is something that has been happening under my nose in my 6.5 years here. People I know who were Portuguese, and I would meet sometimes at events because they come back and visit family. And the
Right.
next thing you know, within a couple of years, they're saying, "Hey, my husband and I and our kid, we're deciding to move back."
I think Portugal is going to be a melting pot like in 10 years because they are trying to incentivize not just immigration, but also all their former colonies.
Hmm.
Those citizens of those places are welcome to come back and work. And so you have a lot more integration of people from around the world than you had really, say, previous to the last 5 to 10 years.
I came here as a tourist maybe 20 years ago, and it was great, but it was very different. You had the same menus in almost every restaurant and stuff. And now there's more vegan places here than I saw in San Francisco. And there's just a whole different sort of cultural influence. So I think it's being welcomed in.
But you said you came here and took a pay cut. Now, did you have a job or did you have your own?
The opportunity was with the pay cut. I could have been paid a lot more money doing something remote work. I ended up working for the first unicorn startup in Portugal. It gave me a sense of just Portuguese customs and culture and what happens when the water cooler talk, all that kind of stuff.
Right.
And I found that fascinating. You pick it up here and there, but it's another thing to live it.
It is easy to live in a bubble here. I love that you just dove in, you went into a Portuguese company and you were able to take that pay cut and just have that experience. Was it an English
Yeah,
speaking office?
that's a good question. It was bilingual. It's very funny because the official company language for communications was in English, but that's on the corporate side. We had a mix. So that sometimes you would get like documents or things that were often English and Portuguese. It was a good sort of nudge to kick us because they don't give you that here in Portugal. You can get by with English all the time and nobody's really going to force you.
There's cultural differences that are beyond language. What are some of the cultural differences you found working in a Portuguese environment?
The company I worked for was a bit of a renegade in the sense that it didn't follow what's more typical here. Portugal is dominated by small and medium sized businesses.
Mhm.
And often those tend to be family owned and operated, hierarchical, very traditional. Even in our company, you I would come across certain types of customary ways of approaching things. The US is a bit more egalitarian, I think, particularly younger generations now feel like, hey, I can just storm into the CEO's office. I'd see the CEO when I would visit like London and shake his hand and with no big deal. But I was also more senior. There's a certain sort of propriety of just being polite. It's a very polite society and almost in a formal way. I would sometimes have these cases where you get into a little bit more of the traditional approach to how people talk about issues and maybe don't talk about things directly. That is probably one of the differences I noticed. I ended up managing to find just more things here interesting, the opportunities. I love the cultural difference in which they were looking at. I was seeing how they had more of a humanistic and a little bit more of a value of arts and culture. And that was an interesting dimension to me that I just was not getting in San Francisco and the Bay Area. So that's what pulled me to look here.
Did you like look on LinkedIn jobs?
Basically network with people in Portugal like
Okay.
mad, and people were super open. They were incredibly generous in terms of not only talking to me. Here, they're just curious and they're like, "Yeah, sure, I'll meet you." It's a lot more informal. It's a little bit more social that way. And so people would be very open to that, and then they would introduce me to other people. I ended up connecting something that actually was more mature.
Now your wife obviously moved, I'm guessing, with you.
It's funny because when she first moved here, she had lots of clients back in California, and this is 2018, so a lot of them were
Right.
like, if you don't see you for a few months, we forget about you because that's the
Mhm.
job of usually when you're hustling as a freelancer or
Right.
whatever. And also because does she do work remotely, they're like, you're not here, so the mental cutoff. And this, of course, COVID changed all that, where everybody's like, oh, now everybody's remote, so you might as well be in Malaysia. It doesn't make a difference,
Right.
right? So she stepped that up. Ended up doing some work also across Europe. It's just so funny how primitive U.S. banking seems by comparison when you've been here for a little while. It's one of those funny myths in the U.S. where you can get in this mental idea, oh, we have the best of everything. And then you realize, oh my God, they're 10 years behind.
Yeah. Let me ask you about networking. What has worked for you in terms of increasing your professional network here? Maybe different than the US or the same? What?
Much better here. Like I say, going back to that story about how people are just curious and willing to meet and happy to make introductions. Here, it's much more of you meet people on the street that you met and you talk to them. And oh, of course, I'm in a city, so I can do that a little bit more easily. It's very unusual to get invited over to somebody's house and actually have them host a dinner there, which was we used to do in the US. But it's much more likely you just go meet at a restaurant and that kind of thing.
I agree. I run into people all the time here that I know. We've had a much easier time meeting people here in general. You worked at your unicorn company and you're not there anymore.
Nope.
I know you're not exactly sure where your next steps are, but can you walk me through a little bit of your thinking about your options because other people might be in a similar situation?
It's not again about trying to pay the bills and trying to build some fortune. It's really about, and this has been true even since I came here. I had the mindset of I just want to do good work, be able to work with others and contribute to something that we think is going to give people benefit. And I could play a role in not only making that happen, but also ideally improve the lives of the people I work with. And that's still true. It's just different now because I left the corporate world. I had some health issues to take care of, and it seemed like a good time to step back. And so I've been using the year to just explore some of my passions. I sometimes mentor startups. I sometimes teach at universities here. There's actually an interesting program between Carnegie Mellon University and the Portuguese universities here, like technical, called the CMU Portugal Academy. I'm an ambassador for something called Future Days 25. It's a social gathering that just started in April this year was the first edition. It's become a global event to think about what they call actionable future. In fact, the whole thing where I've been doing teaching for the CMU Portugal Academy happened because last year at a web summit event, which was a satellite event that the mayor was hosting, I came there. I ran into a professor who does really cool work. So I just jumped on. And so that turned out to be a paying gig for me, more freelancing and stuff like that than sort of
Right.
full time. Then picked up, I do a little bit because I have still friends back in Silicon Valley, some technical advising. And then there's a lot just happens in the startup space here that I've kept in touch with in terms of mentoring and being judging for competitions and things like that.
In order to be a teacher, do you have to have a PhD?
No, I don't think so, actually. It depends on the university. Titles and certifications count for way more here in Europe than it does in the US in general. That said, experience does count for something. And since I've done it in a Portuguese company context for 5.5 years and then have other experience, that's what comes to bear. And that's why it was a good fit for me. So it
Okay.
depends. Yeah.
In terms of living and working here, are there any lessons learned that you learned the hard way that you could share?
Nothing's been that hard when you are doing business. uh, you have to also back off from the American tendency to be pretty transactional sometimes, which is
Mhm.
like the thing where you first meet somebody or whatever, and you're asking all about business, and it's whoa, hey, I don't even know you yet. This is part of the cultural context of remembering that you're dealing with humans and individuals, and then you relate at that level first before getting into sort of, oh, what do I need? What's my transaction and that kind of stuff.
That's really good advice and one that I have to keep in mind too, because I do tend to get a little transaction focused
Yeah.
and I love getting to know people, but it's sometimes challenging to navigate that personal, professional. For me, it's a little bit hard. But I love that about here too. We see people we know all the time and it's like you always have to be on your best behavior a little bit because if
Yeah.
we're out at a bar on a Friday night, we're going to see people from our work community and they're going to be
Right.
socializing. If we're at a restaurant, if we're walking at the market.
I'll give you a story because my the I was on the island of Saint George, which is about 10,000 people and more cows than people, which is the island where my wife's family's from. And my wife's mother was back in Napa, California. And while we were traveling there, I had these little like street bullfights, and I was like sitting watching. They do it for churches to support, and they don't really kill the bulls. So I'm sitting at a friend of the family's house. She offered me and a friend beer, but we were like, oh no, that's okay. So we get up, we're sitting on this wall where these bulls are having an attack, and then somebody comes by and he's, hey, he's selling like food and beer, and we're like, sure. When's the last time I had a or ordered a beer sitting on a wall watching a bullfight? And the word got back that, oh, they rejected my beer, but they bought the beer from the guy on the
Right.
wall,
Are
and
you
that
too
came
good
all the way
for
back.
is there any other final words of wisdom that you have for our viewers?
Yeah, I'd say first and foremost, I would advise not trying to recreate what you had back home entirely. There's certain things that are part of your culture, part of your identity and stuff, of course. But what I think is a better way to live is there's a reason why this culture exists and why it's been this way for thousands of years
Mhm.
is it works in context. And it may not necessarily be perfect for everybody, but I think it's important to sort of expect that because often I've seen some expats who've often sometimes the ones who struggle the most are trying to, hey, I came from LA. And it's like, why isn't Lisbon more like LA? Because it's not LA. All right. So you're
Right.
here. Okay. Remember that. But just they do things differently and they may have slightly different priorities. Not that they're not aware of it. That's part of what it means to be in part of a different culture. So
Mhm.
be prepared to change yourself.
I think that's a great tip.
The mentality of people who feel like, oh, I have a car back in the US, I should ship it here. That's a terrible idea.
Mhm.
You're trying to pry your life and plop it somewhere it really doesn't belong,
Right.
as opposed to figuring out how to, in a way that better melds with what the environment here supports, instead of just being this plucked out and isolated thing that you drop. If you work for a company like I did, and I'll be like, "Oh yeah, I'm gonna go to a doctor or something like that," and they're like, "Okay, see you tomorrow." It's just like there's an expectation that things might take longer, and that's okay.
If you're going to move into a culture that has a different pace of life,
Mhm.
you have to also have a different pace of life.
Right.
Greg, it was so nice talking to you.
Pleasure.
If you have a question for Greg, please put it in the comments. And if you have ideas for future episodes of Global Professionals in Portugal, I would love to hear them. Thank you for watching.
Thank you.